Welcome back everybody to Environmental Science 101. So here we've got our second section, we've got ecological relationships. Stuff that's not just feeding. So what are we going to talk about? We are going to talk about symbiosis, a term that maybe we've heard before. What is this? This is some sort of not necessarily feeding relationship between our two species in a community, right? We should know, right, that organisms in a community are going to interact. It could be direct, it could be indirect, but they are all going to form some sort of interrelationship with each other. Part of what makes these things so complicated, right? You can never look at one part in isolation. They only really do what they do when you put the whole system together. You can't reduce it, really, or break it down. But we can still talk about the nature of those interrelationships and how they are the same or different. We'll talk about parasitism, commensalism, and mutualism. And our starting point example, one which maybe we've heard of before, for mutualism, which we'll get to, is going to be our clownfish inside of the anemone. So what happens here? We've got a mutually beneficial relationship formed between two organisms who are very different, right, in terms of their ecological roles. The clownfish gets protection from the anemone, which is going to sting off things. It gets to be safe here from predators, and in exchange, it gets to scare away stuff, and its waste actually provides nutrients for the anemone to use. So let's talk about parasitism first. Maybe a fun topic, maybe not. So one thing is going to benefit at the cost of another one. That is what defines a parasite, and maybe we already knew this on some level, right? It could be inside or outside the host, right? So we could have leeches on the outside of our host organism, or we can have intestinal worms, right, which are going to be found deep within the individual organism. We can also have cases where the parasite has to be spread by the use of some third party. And by third party, we could look at a mosquito, right? So we've got some sort of parasite, right? And the parasite doesn't go directly into a person. It has to be transferred by something called a vector in the meantime. Now, malaria is going to be one of our most deadly diseases in the developing world, actually, along with dysentery and starvation, maybe among the top 3 issues in undeveloped world which is in a state of deprivation, as opposed to things like obesity, heart disease, or diabetes, which are much more common in our developed world. So this is major. It will come back with infectious disease. Okay, one special example of parasitism. Something that I always found interesting is our cuckoo, right? That's what this thing is. So the way that this thing raises its young is to get something else, another bird, to raise its young. So what it'll do is it'll infiltrate the nest whenever the other bird is not there, right? And this will be our other bird here. Other bird is out of the nest, hunting, gathering food, whatever. Cuckoo comes in and lays its eggs inside the nest, right? And then mom comes back, takes care of the eggs, and some of them hatch into her own offspring, and some of them hatch into a cuckoo. Now, there are some questions here, right? Like, why can't she tell the difference? And the truth is that some birds can and some birds can't, right? And the other question is that why can't she recognize that this thing is different from her? And the answer is that it just wouldn't be efficient for her to do that, right? So our mama bird, right, over many generations, right, is adapting to these different threats and trying to stay on top of it. And the amount of energy and hardware needed for this bird to be intelligent enough to tell whether something is a cuckoo or its own offspring is so much that it ends up not being worth it, right? Because cuckoos are relatively rare, right? And only a small percentage of these birds are going to encounter them. And as just another tidbit, a lot of times the cries, right, the screaming and crying of the baby cuckoo birds is going to be 10, 100 times louder than the other birds in there. Why? Because that is what is going to motivate mom to feed it. And mom is going to say, oh my goodness, this one is so big and strong. I'm so happy that I have such a healthy offspring. When really she's reproducing a cuckoo. And as one more thing on this one, right? So this is how cuckoos reproduce, right? Is by invading the nests of other birds. So they get to be really good at it, right? In fact, every single cuckoo bird that is alive today comes from an unbroken chain stretching God knows how many years back of cuckoos who were all successful at doing this. I find it fascinating. Awesome. commensalism, right? So we did parasitism, now we do commensalism. This is going to be a case where one of the organisms benefits and the other one just doesn't care, right? Is nonplussed. Hope I'm using that word right. So the remora is going to be one example of this, our little fish here. Essentially, shark goes in, kills something much bigger, eats as much as the shark wants to eat, and then the little fish come in afterward and eat whatever the shark didn't want. Shark doesn't care. These things benefit. That is commensalism. Now, mutualism is going to be our last case where we have a mutually beneficial relationship between these two things, right? And our type example, right, our sort of classic example, right, is going to be our legumes with bacteria. So what is the deal between these two things? So soil bacteria live inside the roots of the plant, and they get to be safe there, and they get access to carbohydrates and sugars from the plant. In exchange, they provide the plant with nitrogen, and specifically nitrogen in the right form that the plant needs, which is actually going to be what our next section is about. And so both of them end up benefiting from this trade deal, which is why they keep doing it. If at any point this was not beneficial for one or the other, then they would stop. Although we can safely rely that this will keep happening into the future. So this is going to lead directly into our next topic of nitrogen, how plants need it and where it comes from. So see you then.